In the quiet countryside of Maple County, where the air always smelled faintly of pine and freshly cut grass, there lived a woman named Evelyn Corbin. She was known by everyone as the lady who made the best roasted dishes for miles around. Her small catering business, Corbin's Charcoal Kitchen, had once been the pride of the local market. People would travel from neighboring towns just to taste her food, especially her signature charcoal roasted meat that had a flavor no one could ever replicate. Behind that success, however, was a woman slowly losing control of her life. Evelyn had once been content with simple things: her garden, her recipes, and her modest home on the edge of town. But over time, her ambitions grew. She began borrowing money to expand her business, dreaming of opening a restaurant in the city. At first it seemed promising. Orders increased, her name spread, and for a short while, she lived the life she had always imagined. But her luck didn't last. A series of bad investments and a dishonest business partner left her with crushing debts. The loan sharks she borrowed from were not the kind to forgive or forget. They wanted their money, and they wanted it soon. The weight of it all began to consume her. Every morning, she would wake to find new threatening notes slipped under her door. Sometimes, she would hear the rumble of a car outside at night, headlights cutting through her curtains, a silent warning that her time was running out. The once warm and friendly woman became cold and distant. Customers noticed the change. Her food began losing its magic, her business started to fail, and whispers about her troubles filled the market. In those dark months, only one person remained close to her: her niece, Clara Reed. Clara was the daughter of Evelyn's late sister Margaret, who had died in a car crash with her husband 2 years earlier. The tragedy had left Clara, then just 17, in the care of her aunt. Everyone thought Evelyn had done a noble thing by taking her in, raising her like her own child. They didn't know that she had another reason for being so protective. After her parents' death, Clara became the sole heir to a large life insurance policy. The amount was significant, enough to change anyone's life. Because she was underage, the money was placed in a joint account that Evelyn was allowed to manage until Clara turned 21. Evelyn had promised to keep it safe for her future, but deep inside, the temptation began to eat away at her conscience. At first, she told herself she would only borrow a little, just enough to pay off a few bills. She convinced herself she would return it before anyone noticed. But one withdrawal turned into another, and soon she couldn't stop. The more she took, the deeper her guilt grew. Still, the fear of losing everything drove her to take even more. It didn't take long for the account balance to drop dangerously low, and Evelyn knew that when Clara turned 21, there would be questions she couldn't answer. The girl herself was full of life, the kind of person who brightened every room she entered. Clara had recently started college in the nearby town of Ridgewell, studying graphic design. She often returned home on weekends, bringing stories about her classes, her new friends, and her dreams of traveling abroad. To her, Evelyn was still her kind aunt, the woman who had taken her in when she had no one else. She had no idea that the person she trusted most was the same person plotting against her. One evening, as Evelyn sat at her kitchen table surrounded by overdue bills, her mind raced with panic. The phone had rung earlier that day, a reminder from one of the men she owed money to. The tone in his voice was final. She had 1 week to repay everything or face the consequences. As the rain tapped against the window and thunder rolled in the distance, Evelyn stared at the framed photo of her and Clara smiling together. The longer she looked, the colder her expression became. The idea that entered her mind that night was monstrous, but to her, it began to feel like the only way out. She thought of the money, how easily it could solve everything if Clara were gone. She imagined the insurance company transferring the remaining funds, the debts disappearing, and her life returning to peace. It started as a whisper of desperation, but with each passing day, it grew louder, clearer, and more real. By the end of that week, Evelyn Corbin had stopped thinking like a loving aunt. She had started thinking like a woman with nothing left to lose. The evening Clara Reed disappeared began like any other, calm and unremarkable. A light drizzle fell over Maple County, coating the streets with a silver sheen under the dim glow of streetlights. The smell of wet earth drifted through the air, and the countryside seemed almost too quiet. That night, Evelyn Corbin called her niece and invited her to dinner, saying she wanted to celebrate Clara's good grades and the end of her semester. It sounded like a simple family meal, something they often did together. Clara, unaware of the storm quietly forming behind her aunt's calm voice, agreed without hesitation. She arrived just before dusk, her small car pulling into the gravel driveway of her aunt's home. The house looked peaceful from the outside, with its familiar white porch and flower boxes under the windows. Inside, however, Evelyn had been preparing for more than just dinner. The backyard grill had been scrubbed and stacked high with charcoal, the kind she usually saved for big catering jobs. The kitchen smelled faintly of spice and lighter fluid, though Clara didn't seem to notice. Neighbours remembered hearing faint laughter early that evening, the clinking of plates, and the crackle of a fire starting outside. No one thought anything of it. Evelyn often worked late into the night when she had large orders to fill. By the time darkness fully settled, the laughter had stopped, replaced by the soft hum of the grill and the steady hiss of burning charcoal. When the next morning came, Clara's car was gone from the driveway, but her phone lay forgotten on the kitchen counter. That detail didn't seem strange at first. Perhaps she had gone out early and left it behind. But as hours passed and she failed to answer messages or show up for her weekend plans, unease began to ripple through her circle of friends. Clara had always been punctual, always quick to reply. By the afternoon, one of her classmates, Lena Morris, reported her missing. The local police began with the usual steps. They checked hospitals, nearby roads, and surveillance footage along the route between Evelyn's home and the town centre. Nothing turned up. Evelyn, when questioned, appeared shaken and worried. She told officers that Clara had left after dinner, saying she wanted to take a late drive to clear her head. She even mentioned that her niece had been stressed about exams and money. It sounded believable. The police took her statement, assured her they'd keep looking, and left. But while Evelyn played the part of the grieving aunt, strange things began to draw attention. A few neighbours noticed that Evelyn's grill had been burning unusually long that night. Martin Hale, who lived 2 houses away, later recalled that the smoke smelled different. He couldn't quite describe it, only that it was too sweet, too heavy. Another neighbour remembered seeing Evelyn in the backyard around midnight, wearing her apron and moving something large under a tarp. She waved and smiled when she noticed she was being watched, saying she was testing a new recipe for a customer order. No one asked further questions. In the days that followed, flyers with Clara's photo were posted around Maple County. Local news covered her disappearance, calling it a mystery that has shaken a quiet community. People gathered to search the nearby woods and riverbanks. Evelyn made sure to join them, crying on cue and keeping up her facade of heartbreak. During one televised interview, she stood in front of her home, clutching a photo of Clara and begging for anyone with information to come forward. Her eyes were red, but not from tears. She had stayed awake the entire night, making sure there was no evidence left behind. Despite her efforts, guilt began to crawl beneath her skin. She couldn't sleep without hearing the crackling sound of charcoal. Every time the wind shifted, she imagined it carried the smell of what she had done. Yet in public, she remained calm and collected. She continued her catering business as if nothing had happened, serving the same roasted dishes that had made her famous. Some customers even praised her for working so hard despite her loss. Still, Evelyn's composure began to slip in small ways. She started avoiding certain people, especially those who asked too many questions. She refused to let anyone near her backyard, claiming she was redoing the soil for new plants. She burned trash late at night, the flicker of firelight visible through the trees. The more she tried to hide her guilt, the more suspicious her behaviour appeared. Then came the 7th day after Clara's disappearance. That morning, Evelyn awoke to the sound of knocking, firm, steady, and impossible to ignore. The police had returned with new information. They had traced Clara's last phone signal to Evelyn's property. It had gone dead only minutes after she arrived that evening. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, her pulse pounding in her ears, but she forced herself to act calm. She invited them in, offered coffee, and repeated her story word for word. As the officers left, she stood by the window watching them drive away, her hands trembling slightly. For now, she had managed to hold her secret. But what she didn't know was that the very thing she had used to destroy the evidence, the ashes in her backyard pit, was about to betray her. A week after Clara Reed's disappearance, the once peaceful neighborhood of Maple County had become restless. Rumors floated through the air like autumn leaves, each one darker than the last. People whispered about strange smells drifting from Evelyn Corbin's backyard, about the smoke that rose night after night, thick and black, even after the search teams had stopped coming. To most, Evelyn was still the grieving aunt, but for a few, Something about her composure felt unnatural. Martin Hale, her next-door neighbour, had lived beside her for over 15 years. He had seen Evelyn through her best and worst times, and he had always thought of her as meticulous, clean, organised, and careful about everything she did. That's why, when he noticed the foul odour rising from her property one morning, he felt an uneasy chill creep up his spine. It wasn't the smell of burnt food or spoiled meat. It was thicker, sour, and disturbingly sweet, clinging to the air long after the wind had shifted. At first, he tried to ignore it. Maybe she had been experimenting with new recipes, he told himself. But the smell didn't go away. It only grew worse. The next day, he saw Evelyn out back again, shoveling ash from her large iron grill into a metal bin. Her face was pale, her movements quick and anxious. When she noticed him watching, she gave a nervous wave and a forced smile. "Catering job," she mouthed across the fence, before turning her back and covering the pit with a tarp. The sight made Martin's stomach twist. He couldn't explain it, but something was deeply wrong. That evening, when Evelyn left to deliver food to a client, curiosity got the better of him. Martin slipped through the narrow gap between their fences and crept toward her backyard. The air was still thick with smoke, and a faint, sickly odour lingered. He hesitated for a moment, then lifted the corner of the tarp covering the grill. Beneath it was a large, rust-coloured metal tray, blackened by fire. At first glance, it looked like she had been roasting something large, too large for the average meal. When he leaned closer, his heart stopped. Among the charred remains, something pale glimmered faintly in the ash. He reached out with a stick and nudged it. It wasn't coal, it was a fragment of bone. He stumbled back, shaking, his breath catching in his throat. Without another thought, he ran to his phone and called the police. Within the hour, the quiet lane that Evelyn had lived on for decades was flooded with flashing lights and uniformed officers. They moved quickly, securing the property and taping off the area while forensic teams combed through the backyard. Neighbours gathered at a distance, whispering, their faces pale with shock. Evelyn, when she returned to find the police waiting, nearly dropped the catering tray she was holding. Officers began questioning her immediately. She claimed she had no idea what was happening, that she had simply been burning leftover meat scraps from an order. But when the forensic investigators began to sift through the ashes, her story started to crumble. They found several bone fragments, small but distinct, some of them bearing the marks of high sustained heat. Mixed among them were bits of jewellery, melted metal, a small charm bracelet, and part of a gold earring still intact enough to recognise. Evelyn froze when the officers pulled it out. It matched the one Clara had been wearing in her missing persons photo. The remains were sent to the county lab for analysis, and Evelyn was taken in for questioning. She tried to stay calm, insisting that it was all a mistake, that someone had planted those things to make her look guilty, but her voice trembled and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She spent hours under the harsh lights of the interrogation room, answering the same questions again and again. Every word she spoke sounded weaker than the last. 2 days later, the DNA results came back. The burnt fragments from the grill belonged to Clara Reed. The discovery sent shockwaves through Maple County. News outlets flooded the town, reporters crowded near the police station, and neighbours who had once smiled at Evelyn now refused to say her name aloud. The beloved cook, who had once served food at their weddings and celebrations, was now accused of something too monstrous to comprehend. Inside her cell, Evelyn sat staring at the grey wall, her mind spinning. She had believed she could erase everything with fire, that the flames would consume every trace of her sin. But instead they had betrayed her. Every spark had left behind a piece of truth she couldn't hide. She thought of Clara, her laughter, her trust, and the warmth in her voice. For the first time since that night, guilt sank in deep enough to make her tremble. The investigators began piecing together the timeline. The receipts for the charcoal, the extra trays, the lighter fluid, all of it formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The picture was clear. Evelyn Corbin hadn't just lost control. She had planned it. The woman who once fed the town's celebrations had turned her own backyard into the scene of an unthinkable crime. And though the smoke had long faded, the smell of what she had done still lingered in the air, a reminder of how far desperation could drive a human soul. When investigators began to dig into Evelyn Corbin's life, the perfect image she had built for years started to unravel thread by thread. At first, her calm expression and quiet composure fooled some of the officers. She spoke softly, even tearfully, about her missing niece, swearing she would never hurt her. But evidence does not lie, and the detectives soon found that behind her mask of grief was a history of lies, mounting debt, and greed so deep it could swallow anyone whole. The investigation team began by following the money. They traced Evelyn's financial records, pulling bank statements, old business receipts and tax reports. What they found painted a clear picture of desperation. Her catering business had been failing for nearly 2 years. There were unpaid loans, bounce checks, and several warnings from the local bank threatening to seize her equipment. Even worse, large sums of money had been transferred from the joint account she shared with Clara Reed, her niece and only living relative. Those withdrawals were spaced out carefully over months, as if Evelyn thought no one would notice. But now, they were impossible to ignore. The joint account had originally held nearly $200,000, insurance money from the deaths of Clara's parents, Margaret and Henry Reed. It was meant to support Clara until she turned 21. By the time police obtained the full records, nearly $80,000 was missing. The withdrawals had been made gradually, some in cash, others spent on business investments that no longer existed. When investigators checked the nearby ATMs, the cameras revealed something chilling. On multiple nights, a woman matching Evelyn's height and build had been making large withdrawals. She was wearing Clara's hoodie, cap, and even her student ID lanyard around her neck, as if to pass herself off as the younger woman. Forensic experts also examined Evelyn's backyard. The grill and surrounding soil were carefully analysed. Tiny fragments of bone and melted metal were found embedded deep in the ash, far more than what could have been explained by any catering work. Underneath the ashes, police discovered remnants of duct tape, a partially burned cloth that matched Clara's last outfit, and traces of lighter fluid spread across the soil in deliberate lines. It was clear that what had happened was not an accident. It was methodical and planned. As the evidence stacked higher, detectives began to piece together a timeline. 2 days before Clara's disappearance, Evelyn had purchased an unusual amount of charcoal, over 80 pounds of it, from a hardware store. She also bought industrial lighter fluid and a new metal tray large enough to hold a body. When questioned about these purchases, she claimed they were for a catering event scheduled for that weekend, but no client could be found who had placed such an order. Investigators also found that Evelyn had taken out a small insurance policy in Clara's name just 3 weeks before the murder. The policy listed Evelyn as the sole beneficiary. It was a shocking discovery, suggesting that the crime had been more than just an impulsive act of fear or anger. It was calculated, driven by money from the start. Once the evidence became public, the town turned against her completely. People who had once trusted her food now couldn't walk past her property without shivering. Parents warned their children to stay away from the Corbin house. Her catering business shut down overnight, the sign taken down and thrown into the trash. In her holding cell, Evelyn remained silent, staring at the wall as if waiting for it all to fade like a bad dream. Detectives described her as uncooperative at first, then strangely calm once she realized how much the police already knew. When they presented her with photos of the ATM footage, the receipts, and the insurance documents, she didn't argue. She only asked for a glass of water and whispered, "It wasn't supposed to go this far." But she refused to explain what that meant. The final blow came when forensic accountants discovered a series of digital transfers from the joint account to Evelyn's private business. Fund just hours after Clara's death, the timestamps matched the night of the murder. Even after the fire had burned out and the ashes cooled, Evelyn had logged into her computer to move money. She had stayed awake long enough to erase Clara from her life, both physically and financially. By the time the district attorney announced the charges, first-degree murder, insurance fraud, and destruction of evidence, the town that once adored Evelyn Corbin was silent. People gathered outside the courthouse as the police car drove past, their faces lit by the red and blue lights. The same hands that once applauded her cooking now pointed at her with disgust. The truth was no longer hidden under smoke and ash. The motive had been clear all along: money. But what shocked everyone most was not the crime itself. It was how far Evelyn had gone to disguise it, how easily she had smiled at her neighbours, and how she had roasted her own flesh and blood under the same fire that had once built her success. Her secret was burned but not buried. The ashes had spoken, and they told the story she thought no one would ever hear. When the trial of Evelyn Corbin began, the courtroom was filled to capacity. People from across Maple County packed into the wooden benches, hungry for answers. unable to comprehend how a woman once trusted and admired could commit something so horrific. Cameras lined the back wall, journalists whispered notes, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. The story of the aunt who had roasted her own niece over charcoal for money had already spread far beyond the quiet borders of the county. Now, the world wanted to see if the monster behind the headlines would finally break. The prosecution opened with a chilling summary of the evidence. The DNA from Clara Reed's remains, the surveillance footage from the ATMs, the financial records showing the missing inheritance, and the newly discovered insurance policy that named Evelyn as the sole beneficiary. They presented it piece by piece, methodically laying out the picture of a woman who had planned everything from start to finish. The jurors sat in silence as photographs of the burned grill, the metal tray, and the ashes were projected on the screen. A few of them turned their faces away. The defense tried to paint Evelyn as a woman under unbearable stress. They spoke of her debts, her collapsing business, and the pressure from loan sharks who had threatened her life. They suggested that if she had done anything terrible, it must have been an accident, an impulsive act born from panic. But nothing could soften the evidence that stood against her. The facts were too strong, the timeline too precise, and the truth too vivid to twist. Throughout the trial, Evelyn sat motionless at the defendant's table. She wore plain grey clothes, her once perfect hair tied back tightly. Her eyes rarely left the table, even when the prosecution displayed photos of Clara, smiling, vibrant, full of life. When the forensic expert explained how the remains were identified and how long the body had been exposed to the heat, Evelyn's only reaction was a small twitch in her jaw. To the jury, she looked more like a ghost than a living person. One of the most haunting moments came when Martin Hale, the neighbour who had discovered the bones, took the stand. He described how he had smelled the strange odour, how he had seen Evelyn burning charcoal late into the night, and how he had found the fragments under the tarp. His voice shook as he spoke, and the courtroom fell silent. Even the judge seemed unsettled by his description. The moment Martin mentioned the bracelet found in the ashes, several people in the audience gasped. The prosecution's final argument was simple, yet devastating. They said that Evelyn Corbin had not been driven to madness, but guided by greed. She had watched her niece grow up, comforted her after her parents' deaths, and then, when the time came, saw her not as family, but as an opportunity. The attorney's voice echoed through the room when he said, "She didn't just kill her niece, she cooked her like a meal, for money." That line would later become the title repeated across every news headline in the country. The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: guilty of premeditated murder, insurance fraud, and abuse of a corpse. Evelyn Corbin showed no visible reaction as the words were read. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The crowd inside the courtroom erupted into whispers. Some wept, others stared at her in disbelief. In the months that followed, the story refused to fade. The once charming image of Evelyn's catering business was replaced by horror. Her house was sold and later demolished after vandals broke in, unable to stomach the idea of anyone living where such a crime had occurred. The townspeople avoided the area, and even years later, many said the faint smell of smoke still lingered on that patch of land when it rained. Inside the grey walls of Stonebridge Correctional Facility, Evelyn kept to herself. She rarely spoke to anyone. Some inmates said she spent her nights staring at her hands, whispering to herself. Others claimed she could still smell the burning charcoal no matter how far she was from it. There were rumours that she began hearing Clara's laughter in the dark, though no one ever confirmed if that was true or simply a ghost story born from guilt. The case of Evelyn Corbin became a cautionary tale told in documentaries and true crime specials. To the world, it was another shocking example of what greed could make a person do. But to the people of Maple County, it was something deeper, a scar that never healed. Every time someone mentioned her name, there was a heavy silence, as if speaking it aloud might summon the memory of that night again. In the end, there was no redemption, no explanation that could justify what she had done. The woman who once fed joy to her community had instead fed her greed with the life of her own blood. The fire she started had destroyed more than just a life. It had burned through the trust, warmth, and innocence of an entire town. And though the ashes had long cooled, the story of Evelyn Corbin remained a dark reminder that sometimes evil hides behind the kindest smile.